Hello, and welcome to our next presentation. On behalf of the MIT CDOIQ Virtual Symposium, we'd like to thank all of our sponsors who have continued to support the symposium during this very challenging year. Before we thank our partners, we'd like to ask that sometime during the symposium's breaks that you visit our partners' virtual booths. You can also visit the Content Hub on the MIT CDOIQ website for some great partner resources. We'd like to thank the following partners: Deloitte, Informatica, Privacy and Analytics, DAWEX, Fusion Alliance, KPMG, Sandal Consultants, Tamer, Elation, Ali Data, Big ID, Boomi, Caserta, Citizen, Data Kitchen, Garage, Wakira, Pylog, Click, ThoughtSpot, Eckerson, Global IDs, Snowflake, Starburst. And as I said, please make every effort to visit our partners, use the virtual passport, because without them and our partner support, the symposium could not be held. Thank you.
And so it's great to be here, even in today's virtual world. It's amazing what all of us can accomplish and how much our lives have changed. And I first want to thank MIT for asking me to speak for a little bit about the need for all of us data professionals to work together to find ways to solve data problems, especially those that are impacting society, especially COVID, which impacts all of us so intimately. Like many of you, uh, 2020 has been a year like no other. And I'm sorry, I just need to make sure I can advance these. So just give me a minute. I am trying to make sure that that goes the way I need it to. Give me a second. I want to, there we go. How do I advance these? They were advancing quite nicely when I practiced earlier. Here we go. All right. So that's a little bit about me. So, 2020 has been like a year like no other for me and for all of you. None of us knew when the ball dropped, and wherever you were in the world, that the year was going to shape up quite like this one. We knew that who knew that we were going to experience so much change, so much sorrow, and also so much need for data. When the COVID crisis hit for my organization, and I know all of you have stories, and one of the things I think we are missing most about this conference is the chance to catch up with each other one-on-one. Is that moment when we can exchange those stories of what it felt like for each of us. Because all of us, I think, recognized pretty quickly that data was going to be one of the key assets that was going to be needed to solve the health crisis, ultimately the economic crisis, as well as the social crisis that has really been created by COVID-19. And so when we begin to think about it, really data collaboration is what 2020 is about from our perspective. I know that there were many, many things in the first days of the crises that all of you as data professionals were handling, whether it was enabling your organizations to go virtual, finding the ways to protect security of your systems, making sure that your crisis plans were ready to go, making sure that employee information was going to be protected or customer information was going to be protected. And at Mastercard, while we had always had different types of drills and methodologies at the go, what I think was different for us, like many other organizations, was really this whole idea that we were going to have to practice this and do this on this global scale. Right. And so while MasterCard has been using data for both commercial and social impact innovation for many, many years, and we've had very, very strong governance, and we've used all of these enablers that are on the screen for data collaboration. What I don't think we were ready for was how much of a stress test we had to put on all of our practices, all of our data governance practices, all at once, as the realization of what we needed to try to solve in the world was going to have to happen. And this is a chart from actually the World Economic Forum. It's part of a paper that the World Economic Forum published last April in 2019 that we actually worked on. And just for a moment, I'm hoping that this makes sense, right? That for data collaboration to really work to solve problems, you need stakeholder alignment. And boy, did COVID drive all of us into quick alignment into the reality of what needed to be fixed. we need responsible data governance, right? And I'm going to talk about that in order to really generate insights that actually validate and solve problems. And then obviously, as you begin to move through the crisis, can we adopt those insights and can we create, from WEF's perspective, economic sustainability and scalability? And certainly Mastercard as a financial institution and a technology and data company, the economy is what we generally can solve for, but this could be true for the health crisis as well as the social crisis. And so while we were able to quickly navigate the early moments of the crisis, what we discovered was the following: that our customers and our traditional commercial customers and government customers needed help determining what data would be helpful to solve the problems they were facing. And so I'm going to call that problem the data design and fitness of use problem, right? Early days, everybody was kind of scrambling for what data was available and what were we trying to solve. Then we were also finding, as organizations were talking to each other as we tried to collaborate, is that we also had a resource challenge, right? Different organizations were at different points of sophistication. And as we tried to align stakeholders, they weren't sure how to take advantage of their data, or they didn't have the talent, or they didn't have the infrastructure, or they didn't have the governance set up. And so I'm going to call that the data resource challenge for either talent, resources, infrastructure, or governance. And then even when organizations had all of those resources, had the talent to create data insights, or there wasn't a common language between organizations to figure out how to do data sharing quickly, leaving organizations to have to negotiate one-on-one with each other, which is what we do in normal times. But when there were so many players in an ecosystem trying to solve the problem, it became quickly very, very difficult to do the normal governance process. And that's what I'm going to talk to all of you about today. And how do we solve that so that we can move quickly from negotiation to actual problem solving and to actual data sharing, or information sharing, if you will, to solve these problems of collaboration. And so we'll call that the consistent ecosystem challenge. And that ecosystem challenge just gets amplified the more players you try to bring to the table to solve common problems. And of course, this was the exact situation all of us found ourselves in the earlier part of this year, as COVID and all of its attendant problems that needed to be solved for businesses to survive, for academic institutions to function, for governments to function, and know what moves to make next, we were all scrambling to do this together. So when we look at data sharing for innovation, especially for social impact, it requires so many challenges to be solved all at the same time. Many of you have already been navigating this space successfully through your individual agreements, partnership arrangements, but for many of you, this is new territory. And at Mastercard, we've been really handling data sharing for research. We've had a governance process for this exact space for quite some time. Over 5 years ago, Mastercard's Center for Inclusive Growth was born out of this idea that data for social impact was an important asset that we needed to be looking at and using. And so we've had a process, and I'll go into this in more detail in a minute. We had this governance process set up: evaluation of data philanthropic partners, scope of work, detailed review by a governance board that contains folks like myself and people on my team, our privacy team, our security team, folks in our philanthropy group, communications, legal, etc., understanding how we would have security, privacy protocols, data sharing protocols, creation of sandboxes and the like, and how we would review publications. But what we found out as we started doing this during COVID, how in the world could we do this quick enough so that it would make sense, so that we could solve the problems that were happening on such a rapid pace? And what we found out very quickly was that this process really worked for one-on-one data sharing, right? When we had a data donor organization, as we begin to think about them, companies that have the data, and we needed to give it to an organization that we'll call a data recipient or a research organization that was going to use the information, much like you heard this morning in the Johns Hopkins example, right? Where information was going to be provided to begin to solve the health problem of COVID. But these are the questions, and these are just some of the questions that different organizations on both sides of this data problem have to solve and have to begin to talk through. If you're a company or an organization that has a robust data set or can create what we will call information insights from your data, because nobody really shares raw data because there's too many privacy, security, and other types of concerns, intellectual property concerns. But if you have information that's going to be useful to solving a problem, really, these are some of the questions that you have to answer, even as you're just dealing with one other organization. What data is available for use? Is it fit for purpose? Does it assist the inquiry at hand? What's the quality of your data? Is it really going to be good enough to answer the questions in a way? Is there bias in the data set that should be disclosed, understood, addressed? Is it, and again, how does that impact the inquiry? What's the reputation of the organization you're about to do work with? How do they handle privacy, security, access to data? What type of data sharing agreements will be drafted? How will the data or insights be described in the final project? These are just highlights of the so many issues that need to be addressed as you're working just with one other organization. And that organization who's going to perhaps work with you, perhaps in a research sandbox, but how are they defining the project or inquiry? So many organizations, governments that came to us in the early days who wanted to have data couldn't even define the inquiry, couldn't define the project, didn't even know what data or how to define or to scope the data questions. What data would they require, not just from us, but from other organizations? How would it be used, shared, stored? Who would have access? Would the resulting insights be handled securely? Were there privacy issues, re-identification issues? How would members of the research team be vetted so that you knew exactly who and what their reputation was? What were the protocols? And then ultimately, how long will the data be retained? How would it be stored? How would it be destroyed? And then are there any other beneficiaries, downstream impacts that everybody needs to be thinking about? And this is just in a one-to-one relationship. Only gets more complicated as we go on. So when you look at we thought at Mastercard, we had some baseline understanding of this. But when we really got into looking at the COVID moment, what we began to recognize is that our responsibility and our governance process was almost too slow. It was very thorough, but it was too slow to answer the urgent questions that our customers and our government partners, academic institutions were asking of us for the purchasing information that was going to be helpful for the economic crisis that was unfolding right in front of our eyes. Because as different parts of the world began to shut down, it was and then reopen, because remember, this was a crisis that started in Asia, with parts of Asia shutting down and then reopening, that by the time the virus spread to Europe and then ultimately the United States and Latin America, there was patterns of information that were going to be helpful for governments to make decisions about closures, reopenings, that could assist in how to do it. But how do we pull that information, and how could we accelerate this process while still making sure that we were using this and making sure that it was really robust? And while this is a high level slide, the creation of a governance team that is nimble and thoughtful and well versed in the kind of data inquiry was really, really important. And for the most novel uses of information, it really took the highest level governance council of privacy, security, legal, data design expertise, data analytic expertise, information architecture experts, machine learning, AI, and communications to pull together. Really, the assessment of the use cases and an understanding of our own data more than anything else. And was this something that we thought would generate insights really was important, as well as the reputation of who we were working with. We received a lot of government inquiries, but was the government, and there was a wide range of governments that wanted information, but was the government really ready to actually use the information, and were they going to use it in a way that was going to be sustainable for a solution that wasn't ultimately going to answer the initial question, but perhaps do harm to the population later on? Could we agree on security and privacy protocols? Because many of our data for social impact initiatives are actually done on soil inside of Mastercard, right? We asked data scientists to join our data scientists to do the work, and what kind of infrastructure needed to be spun up. And then obviously the lawyers have to get involved. The duration of the project, key checkpoints, retention, destruction, and with all of our expertise, and we have a lot of expertise. We have data fellows that we work with on a regular basis, like these three folks that I'm just putting here. We thought that we could handle it, and even we were surprised because it does take time to do this. And when the pandemic hit, the pandemic just doesn't have time that you can wait for. Because what happened with COVID, and I think happened for everybody, is that the requests were relatively nonstop. And after a while, after we hit the first few weeks, it became clear that a pattern of requests was emerging that we could bucket. And if we took a pause as data experts in the firm, we could begin to bucket it and begin to find solutions that were similar to the requests that we were getting from lots of different potential partners, lots of different researchers, lots of different governments, lots of different customers. And all of a sudden it began to emerge that we didn't have to use every inquiry as a separate project, but instead begin to put things into buckets of problems and buckets of opportunities that we could solve as types of solutions and types of opportunities for us to pursue. So I'm going to go through just quickly one of the potential opportunities that came our way that was absolutely one of the issues that everybody was talking about in the early days of COVID. There were governments, there were private sector companies, there were academic institutions involved in this one, there were healthcare providers. Everybody wanted in on contact tracing or vaccine tracing applications. And so everybody was trying, governments in particular, to try to come up with how could we get ahead of this virus, either by understanding where individuals who were either infected or protected were, so that we could leverage that information to either shut down society from the standpoint of somebody who had the virus, or open up society as vaccines are administered, right? These are the two things that everybody was trying to get ahead of. And so our data, people came to us and said, what data do you have for that effort? And this is a high level picture of another picture I will show you. But what essentially the idea was, could we get enough information out of healthcare providers, whether that was virus status or vaccine status, and do enough to verify the results, all with the consent of individuals, to share that information in a way that we could then use location data that we had where people transacted. So it wasn't so much about your transaction data at Mastercard, right? That was not the intent. It was that we know where you've been based upon where you've transacted. Our point, what we call our point of sale information, might be helpful to enable you to move around society by connecting that to some health information about you as an individual. And in this slide is really the vaccine results, so that you could actually move about society, that, or that you have received a positive, a negative test result, that you were virus free at that moment, which also could enable you to move around society. So these were the ideas early in COVID. Now we know so much more about the disease. We know it's so much more airborne than we thought at the time. But these were some of the ideas that were being vetted. And we knew our data could be used as part of the solution. And so I have at the top of this slide that we had to understand the data collection, both ours and the partners. We had to understand consent management to understand how individuals would understand both how their health data was being used, but also how we would be clear about how our point of sale and location information might be used, how data might be used by a number of different parties, how that would be understood. But then the data ecosystem of connecting all of this, how would it be built? How would it be managed? how would somebody understand the information, infrastructure, and how would this be created and sustained? Because Mastercard was just one piece of this potential puzzle and solution. And what happened as we did this is that we recognized that governance was really important. But what happened, even as we could solve our pieces using some of our point of sale assets, our digital identity assets, some of the payment assets, both our physical card, but more importantly, a lot of payment on phone information, that we could really robustly help create something with a lot of partnership from other companies. But the challenge really was the ecosystem, because the network of passing this much data across so many organizations is really, really a challenge. We go back to, it was a data design challenge. Even with a bunch of organizations with a strong commitment to strong data practices and a strong commitment to social impact, we're going to struggle with creating consistency from data classification to data sharing to data collaboration to make this happen. We don't have standards across markets. So one of the first organizations that were most interested in this were travel organizations, airports, right? Airlines, stores, entertainment, hotels, just to enable movement. But we knew that by the time we were working with so many organizations, there were no easy standards to enable this. While we could solve the talent, we certainly had enough talent to do this, but the infrastructure was much, much harder to solve. But the real challenge, and when I put up this next slide, you'll see that the real challenge has to do with the ecosystem to make this happen. To get all the consents together, to get personal data management, to do the analytics, to connect the control and consent, and to get all the medical labs together to understand how all of this would work. This is just on the Mastercard side to connect it to the greater ecosystem. This was a big challenge that was much, much harder to solve. And while we're proceeding and we're continuing, it brought to life that what we have is, as a community, while we can solve societal problems, it takes time and it takes energy. And we still, when we want to solve things at scale, that leverages data from multiple sources, we still lack an easy way to share data, to share information, to solve for common purposes. And there's a number of stumbling blocks that will have to be removed. And this is our challenge as data officers, as data professionals, that I think we have to focus on, not only for this crisis, but for the next one. Because when you look at data sharing for social innovation, it isn't about just two parties. There are multiple data sources, there are multiple data beneficiaries and data recipient organizations that sit on both sides. But the real key is, what are the ecosystem enablers that have to be put into place to make this happen? Because we always will have organizations that have valuable data and have talent and infrastructure that understand that data. And we will always have organizations that want to use that data for good, for a common purpose that will create data sets and products and solutions, if you will, that can benefit many of us. But how to enable that is still being built. And that's what we need to focus on. Can we create some commonalities? There are vendors doing that. There are selected organizations focused on that. But how can we get there? And then what's the impact on the individuals that would benefit? That's the other piece. What about the people at the core of this? While organizations have a great power to do this, how do we make it happen while we keep our eye on the people that this will impact? This is data sharing for social innovation. This is the ecosystem that we have to think through, and there has to be some commonalities to make it really happen. When you break this down, there's so much richness that has to be defined. We need responsible data practices on the data donor side. All of us need to commit to privacy of the underlying information. Use of anonymization and de-identification techniques are like mom and apple pie, as is security of information, right? Building codes of conduct for data sharing or doing research, right? On premises or in sandboxes, data quality standards, accuracy standards, standards for not using fake data or spotting fake data, right? What are our standards for bias minimization, right? For machine learning and AI, the list goes on. When you look at, I'm going to just flip quickly to the data recipient organization, what are the standards for formulating the problems? And how are they explaining the data they need so that we on the donor side with the recipient organizations can understand the fitness of different data sets for the inquiry? How do we make sure that data analysts and scientists can actually have the right data skill sets? Because not all data recipient organizations have those skills. How do we make sure that we have the right skill sets? And then we need ecosystem enablers, right? Whether that's the expertise, the platform, the legal and contractual agreements need to be standardized so that we do not waste time and energy on negotiating things that could be negotiated ahead of time. Ethical standards, review boards, facilities to share data, whether those are labs or cooperatives where those work, and then the individuals who can translate between use cases, identity of data, fitness for purpose, and then also regulatory education and compliance. And last but not least are the individuals. We must design this whole ecosystem with people in mind. We know that we want to solve, in this case, COVID for all of us, for our kids, for our parents, for those who have compromised immune systems, and just so that we have a society that can move about freely. But we know that people are at the center of this, whether it's about their business losses, the economic impact to them, whether it's their health impact, or all of the social ills that have been spun up that we now are realizing because of COVID. But if we don't really design everything, understanding the impact of the solution on people, no matter what the issue is, and that we might cause some harms in unintentional ways because we are making assumptions or conclusions about individuals that may be suitable in one situation, but may cause them harm in another, we may wind up in a world that we do not want to live in. So that has to be at the center of all of our inquiry for social innovation. There are some good news, though, out there, right? We heard about Johns Hopkins today. There's also an effort that Raj Chetty is doing at Harvard for an economic opportunity insights. We're participating in this effort with him. This is where academic institutions can play a very significant role, where commercial institutions and others can contribute insights to begin to create data sets that are powerful to begin to help us understand impacts. Now, they may not be the solutions. They may not ultimately come up with the product set, the trackers that we want, the ability for us to know exactly the movement of each other, but they can begin to give us senses of what is happening that can lead to solutions. These type of initiatives by Johns Hopkins, by Harvard, by MIT, and others, I do think hold the key as a key first step in us being able to collect information in a thoughtful manner that helps us begin as data scientists to look for the solutions and to gather information that's the baseline of creating solutions, rather than in our rush of the earliest days, right, to just begin to immediately solve. This type of data set, like the Johns Hopkins data set, provides information to the true experts in fields to begin to actually understand what is happening and what do we need to solve in a much more mindful way. So this, I actually think, is something that we need to understand better as part of the different opportunities to solve different problems as we move forward. So I'm going to end with what we really learned. Mastercard has built our whole program on our data responsibility principles. And these principles really in the middle of our circle is that we really focus on the individual, and that we believe an individual has the right to own their personal data, that they get to control their personal data, that they should benefit from its use, and that in return that they should have the right to expect privacy and security, and that any organization that they give it to should protect their information. And that guided us well during this crisis. And that in turn, what we do is we provide security and privacy, that we're accountable for the use of information, that we give transparency and control to individuals. But more importantly, when it comes to innovating with data, that we will have integrity in our practices, that we will innovate, and that we also will innovate for social impact. And all of that really did guide a lot of our decisions as we were changing things, deepening our practices in some ways on governance, but also really re-examining them in order to move faster and with greater speed, recognizing that every product, every insight that we created, and we created many for our customers. We now have a tracker that tells our cardholders when our stores open, when are they closed, because now we know from when transactions are processed, when are every business in a neighborhood open and closed, right? We can now give that information because now we understand how communities are reacting to this virus. There are tons of examples like that that are innovation enabled, right? That give our customers better information than we had only a mere 6 months ago. But all of our activities have been guided by these principles. But as we move forward, we recognize that we have to do more, that we have to really think through what are our best data practices for creating responsible data sharing. And we recognize that we need to really move forward on this notion of what do we do for ecosystem sharing. And I think we're beginning to think through with other organizations that are members of our responsible data collaborative, that how do we establish codes of conduct that outline the requirements of the parties? Also, what's the governance between parties as we begin to do more and more data sharing? Can we get closer to the standardized elements of legal agreements so that contracts don't take as long, and that we address routine compliance and liability issues? Can we establish our fiduciary responsibilities of the parties ahead of time? Can we identify what those should be? And also, what are the responsibilities of us to any what we're calling beneficiary, downstream beneficiaries of any products and projects for social impact, for societal good, which is ultimately those of us in humanity that we want to impact in a positive way? Can we come up with common methodologies for defining use cases, for fitness of use, so that we can come up with methodologies that we can talk quickly to each other as data professionals, whether we are a company that's giving the data or an organization that's receiving it? Can we come up with common assessment tools for vetting of partners, assessing reputation, assessing privacy practices, assessing security, assessing access controls, and understanding who will actually have access to data, and the reputation for retention, destruction, or how an organization has used data itself? What are those protocols, and what are those kinds of common standards that we can get ahead so that they're not the negotiation points that slow down innovation when it is needed most? So these are just some of the examples that we've put together, but we're working with other companies, and if you're interested, please drop me an email, shoot me a line on LinkedIn, because we're looking for others to join us with our data responsibility effort. But we do think that data sharing is the next generation of what is needed, and that we need responsible data sharing if we all are going to solve the crises of today, but also of what's ahead. And we think that, that this has been an opportunity moment as much as it's been a difficult moment for many of us. And for all of you that have lost anyone, my personal sympathies, because it has been a really difficult and strange year. But it is also a year full of opportunity for us as data professionals. We actually are solving problems. We matter in the conversation. Data will solve parts of this crisis in ways that we could not have imagined on December 31st of 2019. But we're also going to look back on December 31st of 2020 and know we had an impact. And I believe if we begin focusing on the data sharing aspects of our job with each other, I think that December 31st of 2021 will look even more powerful than we look right now. And so I invite all of you to work with each other and with me to figure this out, because I do think that the world is looking at us to figure it out. And there is nobody better than the Chief Data Officer to do that. And so I thank you for listening to me. I hope we're going to have some conversation and question. I thank you for listening to me for this time, and I'm open. I will open the floor to questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, JoAnn. I really enjoyed listening to your session. Your insight and expertise is invaluable. We did receive some questions, and I copied them into the chat so you can read them along with me. But the first one is, how did you address security concerns in establishing new relationships across the ecosystem?
Sure. So security is super important to us. First, we look at what data is being shared, right? But we do a security due diligence on our partners typically. So that's part of our normal governance. What we've done is we've created a smaller security due diligence questionnaire for anybody that is going to receive any type of data. The good news, though, is as we've gotten more mature, and we're sharing information insights, it becomes less of a question, right? That we have to have. There's no raw data being shared, so the security due diligence becomes a little bit lighter, and that we can just ask some very basic questions. Because in the example of Harvard, for example, while we care about their security of their opportunity insights, we recognize that that's really on them, and that the liability really rests with them should that information be misused, right? Our detail information, the liability is much less. And that's, if you can think about those issues ahead of time, then as long as the baseline is there, then the issues go away. So it depends on what you're sharing. I mean, we want baseline security, of course, but if the information there is not that sensitive, then you don't have the heightened level that we would care about on our own systems that we require on baseline Mastercard.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great answer. Question number 2, how are you addressing compliance and data localization?
So, compliance is just, it is really when you look at how we handle all of our data compliance, right? So what we handle that as part of our everyday. So when you think about data for social impact, we are looking at a lot of insights that are being derived. And so data localization allows us to do the insights in wherever we have to do it locally, but the insights can actually be exported to a central location. So the raw data can stay where it's needed to be. If it's a jurisdiction that requires us to keep the transaction data locally, but then we can have a data scientist on soil, or we can look at the data while it remains on soil with a centralized scientist, if that's allowed in that jurisdiction. But then the insights can be pulled together globally, and then we can pull that information globally and share that information. So we're able to do the compliance that way with on soil. I know on soil is a problem for many of us in the financial sector, for sure.
Great. And question number 3, how has Mastercard benefited in the long run from this challenge? Have you reached a level of performance that might have taken much longer to realize?
I think that I'm going to answer the question in kind of 2 parts. I think we have benefited overall from our commitment to data for social impact, in that it has helped me and my colleagues really think very, very broadly. When we started this journey back over 5 years ago, it was Mastercard recommitted to just all of our philanthropic efforts. And like every organization, that meant, money. It meant, but we also began to look at our technology platforms as well as our people, our talent, and began to really commit to this whole idea of social impact, right? And what could we do to really foster inclusive growth and help with the financial divide in the world. And we came to the idea of using our data partly because of the relationships that we formed with an awful lot of different NGOs and groups that were serving underserved populations from a financial perspective. And they said to us, we could use some help in understanding these populations. Do you have any data that could help us? And we tread very, very carefully in the early days on how could we do this in an ethical way. Would it make sense to our cardholders, our banking customers, to governments, to regulators? And so we really established our governance in a very tight way, right? So we tread very carefully. We started very slowly. Um, and so we've had, luckily, this time to kind of vet questions, do, pilot initiatives, try this. That's one of the reasons when we started with data for research and then we had our data fellows, the idea there was, well, let's do a research project. Okay, we think we did that. Okay, let's do a project with a data researcher that's going to do a line of inquiry, but can do a series of research projects, right? And then we we kept revising and strengthening our governance process. So we've had some time to learn it. What COVID did was, I think, pressure tested our governance process in a way of, can you do it faster? And will it be as robust? And the good news was that because we had so much experience under our belts, we knew where to probe, as well as we were very, very motivated, I guess is the word, to respond in a way that was not a no, we can't do it. It was, we've done this before, we can get to a yes, but we have to be mindful, and we need to be balanced, I guess. And so I think we have benefited, the governance process has benefited, the teams have benefited, and I think the company has benefited in that we are looked at by our partners, whether on the commercial side, because we've done some commercial innovation for COVID as well, and the governance process is similar but different. That we are looked at as a really, really good partner from whether it's governments, NGOs, civil society, or our commercial partners. We are looked at as a willing partner to listen and to try. We didn't say yes to everything, because you can't, but we did say yes to an awful lot, and we tried to be helpful as much as we could, in the spirit of, this is a very unusual time, but always being mindful of regulatory compliance and legal compliance, as well as privacy and security, and our own principles as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Valerie Logan says, excellent perspective, JoAnn. Thank you. What role do you see the growth of data literacy playing across the ecosystem?
Oh, wow. Okay, so, I think that the good news is, I think that the world is more literate now than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago for sure. And I think that COVID has actually helped data literacy. I actually think that the average Joe or Jane, right, is beginning to understand that data exists in the world and that data solves problems. I think that there's, because of the conversations that have been had about the need to do contact tracing, for example, right? And not that everybody's doing it well, but that so many governments have been trying to do contact tracing of all of us and our virus status. I think that the gathering of data, right, about who you've been in touch with, right, and that type of information is penetrating individuals' consciousness about what data can do, and also how complicated it can be to collect that information, use that information, gather it, and then really extrapolate it to larger populations, right? Because I think when you're in smaller clusters, we've seen some events where people have been able to do the contact tracing and shut viral spread down. But that when you do it in larger cities, it's more difficult. At least in the United States, that's been much of the conversation. I think that in and of itself is increasing data literacy. I think too that we're going to see that individuals are going to understand the value of their information and are going to ask more questions about it than they may have in the past. And so that's going to be increasingly important, that we explain things. I also think, though, that COVID has made governments also much more literate about the power of information and data about their citizens. And I think that's going to create some tensions that we're going to see some of those impacts as well. So I think more to come on both sides of that.
Yep. Next question here. How did Mastercard go about identifying which data to make available and turn it into a product to share with other institutions?
So I should have started with that we never share what I will call our raw transaction data with unrelated third parties. So what am I talking about? So if you use your Mastercard, and I hope many of you do, your personal transaction information is never shared with anybody else. So nobody knows that yesterday I bought a rug on my Mastercard. Okay, first of all, we don't even know that Mastercard doesn't know that I bought a rug. They know that I transacted at where did I buy it from? Grandin Road, okay? And they know the date, the time, the place, okay, which would be online, right? But what we do with information is typically what we call aggregate information, right? It's not particularly interesting to anybody that JoAnn bought something of a value of, I don't know, I think I paid like $500 for the rug, $500 at this merchant, Grandin Road, online on August, what day was yesterday? 17th, right? 2020. We don't know it's JoAnn, we know the card number. What we do with our data typically, while we'll monitor for fraud at an individual card number level, and we'll provide security at that level, and we'll provide those transactions back to my bank. My bank is Bank of America. What we'll do with the data at Mastercard is we aggregate it, meaning we look at all the transactions for a day, or we look at all types of transactions at gas stations or supermarkets or other types of industries, right? To look at patterns of information over time and in geography or within industry. And that's the type of information, it's mostly econometric information that is of interest to financial institutions like our banks or to governments, and as well as across time. What does that mean? So oftentimes our information is helpful to know before and after. So what do I mean? So if before we can look at what happens to communities when you invest in a hospital in a certain location or a university, right? So what was that community's purchasing? What was just general economic purchases total for that community before the hospital was put in there, and then a year later after the hospital was put in? Did it generate more merchants being in that community, and then did the community spend more, right? So we can look at things like that, and that's the type of information that we generally can create in response to requests. So we have data scientists that can pull our information into those type of what we call aggregations or information insight reports. And that's the type of information that's usually available both for commercial projects or social impact projects. So that's the type of information that we have available.
Great, thank you. Next questions. We've got lots of questions flooding in here.
Okay.
We still have about 22 minutes left, so we'll do what we have time for here. Next one, Mastercard launched into emergency mode. Did all internal players get on board right away, or was there any resistance?
I think you're talking about crisis, kind of the moment of kind of crisis management, and yeah. So we've always had drills. We've had incident response, and we've also had a crisis readiness program for many, many years. That we've had different drills, and we've done them all the way up through our board. We've had, breach response events. We've created a whole playbook of different events. And so going remote was always one of the events, I think. And because so many of our employees traveled, working remotely was something that all of us knew how to do. I think what was different with this one was at one point, I think 90% of our employees were working virtual, right, around the globe. And I think that was different. I don't think we were ready for that volume of virtuality, if that's a word, but we were ready. We prepared for this. We know that our network really can't go down. Too much of the world really wants their transactions to go through, even if you're shopping from home, right? So we were really quite ready, and our employees responded terrifically. We didn't miss much of a beat. I mean, we all went home in our various offices. It started obviously in China for us, and Hong Kong, and then Singapore. Our offices went to virtual, 100% virtual. And then slowly but surely, you watched our offices, go to virtual, so that by the time we went virtual in March, I think it was like March 13th was my last day in the office. We were ready. And then it was interesting to watch some of our offices go back. And what we've done is we've done like split shifts to do social distancing. And an office like Singapore went back and then got shut down again, right? And that's our Asia headquarters. And so we were, but we were talking to each other. We're a very global company. So talking like this was pretty normal. I mean, we do more video now than maybe we used to, but I have to say that that team and our technology folks, it was pretty amazing. Yes, in the beginning there were some dropped Skype calls and dropped meetings, right? But pretty quickly our infrastructure was able to handle it, and I don't know, it's been a pretty amazing year. So the crisis management team, hats off to them, and to all of our employees, my whole team, everybody's been just terrific about it.
Wonderful, thank you. Next one, I did misspeak earlier. We got about 10 minutes left, not 20.
Okay.
So this one is, I am assuming that the data you're using for COVID-19 has to do with location or transaction types, correct?
Not so much transaction. I don't know what they mean by transaction type. I think I explained earlier that it's usually industry, information, aggregations by industry. Location is a little bit trickier. It's not as much as your specific location as it's usually by an aggregated geographic area. So zip code, usually it would be the postal code, or by city, town, state, or region is usually the type of analysis that we do. It can also be a country. It can be corridors. We usually can do some travel analysis when we're all traveling. So those type of things. But we have minimums that we apply so that we make sure that it's always minimum aggregations of certain sizes.
Awesome. All right, is Mastercard providing the sandbox for your partners to collaborate on your data?
Yes. Most of the time we invite folks into our what we call our Mastercard Research Center, which is a sandbox that we provide, yes.
Great, let's see. What data standards, taxonomies, models did you look at regarding the overall ecosystem, such as across health, finance, travel, and other applications?
Oh gosh, I'll have that one. If somebody would email me that, I'm happy to take that one offline. I don't have all of that in front of me, but trust me, it was quite extensive. So I'd have to dig that up. I don't have it in front of me, but happy to have a chat separately. That's a great question, though.
Yep. Did you use a COBIT or COBIT, COSO, or some type of ISO governance standard as a starting point in building your own governance model?
Yeah, we did use COBIT for sure, and but it has evolved into our own. It was a good starting place.
As the CDO, how are your peers measuring success of what your team is doing?
My peers inside of Mastercard, I'm going to assume, if that's the question. Because I don't know how my CDO peers are measuring my success outside of the company, so I'm going to assume inside.
Mastercard, yes.
So I think that my peers inside the company, we have a whole bunch of KPIs. Again, I'd have to pull them up, but the KPIs are wide and varied. In this case, it's the number of initiatives that we've enabled, right, would be the ones that we would be mostly interested in. How many different social impact initiatives have we enabled? How many new products have we enabled? How many new commercial insight reports, et cetera? So that would be, so it's mostly business initiatives that we've enabled, and the related, on the commercial side, the related revenue. So those would be the types of metrics that we would be reporting.
Great. Yep, that will do it for Q&A. We've got lots of positive feedback on here.
Good. Okay.
This one says, very inspiring reminders about looking at challenges 360 to find real solutions in a timely manner. Lots of people saying it was very inspiring. So thank you so much.
Well, I'm glad. And again, if any of your organizations are interested in data for social impact or just data sharing and want to get in on developing any of the common solutions, we are trying to publish a paper that kind of evidences some of the best practices. So if you guys have any ideas, I'm all ears, because we are trying to get some of the best ideas down on paper, and we are looking for organizations to join in with us. So please get in touch. I am on LinkedIn and happy to link in on this topic. So
JoAnn, I've got a question. Can you hear me?
yes, I can, Peter. Hi.
Dr. Wang runs a certification program once or twice a year for aspiring CDOs that is offered by CDOs. And one of the elements of it has to do with the leadership prowess, the leadership capabilities of the CDO, the ability to pull folks across the enterprise together to all row in this new direction. And I have a feeling that before CDO, before COVID, CDOs had more of a challenge than, per your presentation here, people really had to jump on board to get into crisis management. What advice do you have for aspiring CDOs to pull the enterprise together to get behind all the values that data offers us?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this is a good moment to have some of those conversations, especially now. I think we've moved from crisis to kind of a new stability moment right now, right? I think organizations are figuring out what's next as they understand the impact to every organization. Every organization's different. So there's a moment right now where organizations are trying to figure out what's going to happen for 2021, right? A lot of companies are doing their budgets. A lot of companies are understanding 2021 is not going to be a robust year. It's going to be a strange kind of year as we eventually come out of COVID. I think that 2021 is the mixed year, right? We'll at some point have some curatives, some vaccines, et cetera. This is the time to begin to talk to your colleagues about what they're planning, right? So if you are an aspiring CDO or a data scientist or a product designer that uses data, go off and have a conversation about what is your organization planning? What kind of products, solutions are they either continuing or thinking about? And understand what are the data needs, right? And list them out for them. They're not going to understand what those are. They think they do, and they always are asking, what's the data strategy? And it's like, my answer is, well, what's your business strategy? And I'm happy to lay out then, what new data do you need? What is our current data good for, right? And what type of analysis is going to be needed? And then all the ugly things that they never kind of get: data classification and data quality, and do we need a new data source, and what kind of data management, and is there a platform to put the data in, right? A lot of business folks don't think about those things, but if you want to be an aspiring CDO, have those conversations in language that they can understand, right? Our jobs is to translate a lot of this, right? And to do it in a way that doesn't make them feel stupid. Don't say it in technology language either. You're not the technologist, you're the data person, right? And if you do that, I think you begin to build a partnership. You become the person that they want to turn to say, okay, explain that to me again. Why do I need that? Because those capabilities need to be built now, right? And a lot of organizations have a strategy playbook that, 2021 is not the year they're going to want to invest in it. But if they have a big appetite for 2022, right, and people are putting that together, but they don't make any investments, right, and they have no platform to put things on, well, guess what? Where are you putting everything? In my pocketbook? It doesn't work, right? So some investments are going to be needed. And if you can start having those conversations that these investments are going to be needed, and it's fine if you don't do it right out of the chute in 2021, but somewhere in 2021, if you have big appetite for 2022, these are some of the investments. That's real data literacy, right? That's data literacy at the cellular level in an organization where you're showing your value as a data professional that no one else can, because you understand what the data needs are in your company. That's what an aspiring CDO can do.
Great. Thank you. Very helpful.
You're welcome.
We appreciate your time and your expertise and your experience.
No, my
I
pleasure.
I know you were affected by the hurricane too, so you've been in and out of power.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Luckily, the power came back last week, but a week ago, I was, last Monday, I was still without power. So it's been a better week since. Let me put it to you that way. It wasn't fun.
Yeah, we really, really appreciate your time.